On the 17th of November, 1869, the deserts of Egypt filled with kings. They came from across Europe and beyond to a raw new town on the Mediterranean coast called Port Said, drawn to witness something the world had been told was impossible. Empress Eugénie of France arrived aboard the imperial yacht, and it was her ship that led the procession. A line of vessels steaming south into a channel of water that had not existed a decade earlier, cut straight through 100 miles of sand to join the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Fireworks lit the desert. Bands played. A gleaming new opera house had risen in Cairo for the season. For the man who had willed it all into being, a French diplomat named Ferdinand de Lesseps, it was the greatest day of his life. The Suez Canal was open, and it changed the shape of the world overnight. A ship sailing from Britain to India no longer had to crawl all the way around the entire continent of Africa. Now it could slip through Egypt and cut the journey by thousands of miles. Every trading nation on Earth understood in that instant that this thin ribbon of water had just become one of the most valuable stretches of ground on the planet. And here's the strange thing about that glittering opening day. The nation with the most to gain from the canal, the greatest sea power the world had ever known, the empire whose lifeline to India the canal now was, wasn't the one celebrating. Britain owned no part of it, not a single share, not 1 foot of the banks. Worse than that. For years, Britain had done everything it could to stop the canal from ever being built. Its statesmen had called it a fantasy and a swindle. They had refused to put in a penny. They had schemed against it in the courts of Europe. The most powerful government on earth had bet, loudly and repeatedly, that de Lesseps's great ditch would fail. It hadn't failed. It had opened in triumph, French-built and French-financed, with Egypt as its junior partner and Britain shut entirely out. So a question hung over the whole affair, and it would take just 6 years to answer. How does the country that fought hardest against the Suez Canal end up owning the largest single stake in it? Not through war, not through a treaty, through a deal done in secret, in the dark, with borrowed money and a banker's word. A deal the British Parliament itself wouldn't learn about until it was already done. The answer doesn't begin with a battle or a boardroom. It begins with a bankruptcy. The slow, spectacular ruin of a ruler who spent his country into a hole so deep that the only way out ran straight through London. The idea was ancient, as old as the pharaohs, who had dreamed of linking their seas. What made it real was one man's refusal to be told no. Ferdinand de Lesseps was not an engineer. He was a French diplomat with charm, connections, and an iron conviction, and in the 1850s he secured the prize he'd been chasing. A concession from the ruler of Egypt, granting him the right to dig a canal across the Isthmus of Suez and to operate it for 99 years. He formed a company to do it, the Compagnie Universelle, the Universal Suez Ship Canal Company, and sold its shares across France to ordinary investors who caught his dream. France bought in heavily. Egypt's ruler took a large block of shares too, and the digging began. It was brutal work. Tens of thousands of Egyptian laborers were driven into the desert to move the earth, much of it in the early years by hand, under a system of forced labor that fed workers into the trench season after season. They dug through sand and heat and disease. The conditions were savage, and many thousands are said to have died in the making of the canal. The exact toll still argued over, the suffering beyond dispute. For 10 years, the channel crept across the isthmus, mile by punishing mile. And all the while, one nation watched with open hostility. Britain. You might think the world's dominant maritime empire would have leapt at a shortcut to its most precious possession, India. Instead, Britain fought the canal at every turn. Its most powerful statesman, Lord Palmerston, was convinced the whole scheme was a French trick, a lever to pry into a region Britain treated as its own road to the east, and a dagger aimed at British sea power. He insisted it could never work as engineering, and that if it did work, it would be a menace. Britain refused to invest. It leaned on the Ottoman Sultan, Egypt's overlord, to withhold approval. It threw every obstacle it decently could in de Lesseps' path. The reasoning wasn't stupid. Britain's whole global position rested on controlling the sea lanes, and a French-owned canal astride the route to India was a genuine threat. But the policy rested on a bet that the canal would either fail or never be finished. And that bet was about to be lost in the most public way imaginable. When the water finally flowed between the two seas in 1869, Britain's opposition curdled into alarm. The canal didn't just work, it became indispensable almost at once. And it was British ships, more than any other nation's, that began pouring through it. Within a few years, the majority of the traffic in this French-owned waterway was British. The empire had sworn the canal would never matter. Now its own commerce depended on a channel it didn't control, owned by a company it had refused to join in a country sliding toward ruin. Britain had lost the argument. Now it needed the canal. The man who ruled Egypt in those years dreamed as big as de Lesseps and spent far more recklessly. His name was Ismail Pasha, the Khedive of Egypt, and he was determined to drag his country into the modern age in a single generation. "My country is no longer in Africa," he famously declared. "We are now part of Europe," and he built as if to prove it. Under Ismail, Egypt laid thousands of miles of railway and telegraph line. He remade Cairo in the image of Paris, with grand boulevards and gaslights and a gleaming new opera house. He expanded schools, harbours and sugar mills. He threw the lavish canal celebrations that had dazzled the crowned heads of Europe. And he paid for all of it with borrowed money. This is the part that would decide everything. Ismail's spending ran far ahead of Egypt's income, and to close the gap, he turned to the banks and bond markets of Europe, borrowing, then borrowing again to service what he already owed, at interest rates that reflected how risky lenders knew him to be. The debt swelled into the tens of millions of pounds, an almost unimaginable sum, and the payments tightened into a noose. Year by year, more of Egypt's revenue vanished into the pockets of European creditors. By the mid-1870s, the richest ruler in the region was effectively bankrupt, running out of ways to keep the money flowing and the creditors quiet. Ismail was desperate, and a desperate man looks hard at whatever he still owns of value. What Ismail still owned was extraordinary. When the canal company was formed, the Egyptian state had taken a huge block of its shares, nearly half the entire enterprise, some 177,000 shares in the Suez Canal Company. It was the crown jewel of Egypt's holdings, a direct stake in the most strategically important waterway on Earth. And by 1875, it was also just about the only thing Ismail had left that anyone would pay a fortune for. So he decided to sell it. Quietly, he put the word out that the Khedive's great block of Suez shares was available to the right buyer, and buyers began to circle. The most eager of them were French financial houses, already bound to the French-built canal, saw a chance to gather Ismail's shares into French hands, and with them, near total command of the waterway. If those shares went to France, France would own the Suez Canal outright, the shortcut to India, the artery of British trade, controlled from end to end by Britain's oldest rival. It was the exact nightmare Palmerston had warned of a generation earlier, now hardening into fact. Word of the sale had not yet reached London. When it did, it would land on the desk of a Prime Minister, unlike any before him. A man who understood, instantly, that the empire had perhaps days to act. And he was prepared to do something no rule book allowed. The Prime Minister was Benjamin Disraeli, and he had spent his whole life waiting for a moment like this. Late in 1875, the whisper reached London. The Khedive of Egypt was selling his Suez shares, and French buyers were closing in. Disraeli grasped the stakes at once. Whoever held those shares held leverage over the canal, and whoever held the canal held a hand on the throat of Britain's road to India. He resolved, there and then, that the shares would be British. But wanting them and buying them were two different things, and between them stood a wall. The price was around £4 million, a colossal sum, and not one the government had lying ready. Worse, Parliament, which controlled the nation's purse, was not in session. To summon it, debate the matter in the open, and vote the funds would take weeks Britain didn't have, and would tip off the French the instant the news leaked. Disraeli needed the money in days, in secret, with no legal authority yet to spend a shilling of public cash. There was only one place on earth that could move £4 million overnight and keep silent. So Disraeli sent his trusted private secretary, Montague Corrie, to the house of Lionel de Rothschild. The scene has become legend. Corrie was shown in and delivered the message. The Prime Minister wanted £4 million, and he wanted it tomorrow. Rothschild, as the story is told, was eating grapes. He took one, ate it, set down the skin, and asked a single question. "What is your security?" Corrie answered, "The British government." Rothschild considered it a moment. "You shall have it," he said. And just like that, in a private drawing room, with no vote and no public word, the money was found. The Rothschild Bank advanced the £4 million. Britain bought the Khedive's entire block, 176,602 shares in the Suez Canal Company, for just under £4 million. In one silent stroke, the empire that had owned nothing of the canal became its single largest shareholder. Disraeli was jubilant. He wrote to Queen Victoria with the news in words that said everything about how he saw it. "It is settled. You have it, madam." The Queen was thrilled. The country, when it found out, was stunned and mostly delighted. Britain had reached into the dark and seized a commanding grip on the most important waterway on earth. And it had done so before France, before Parliament, before almost anyone knew what was happening. It was audacious. By the ordinary rules, it was barely legal, and it worked. But a share certificate is not the same as control. Britain now owned a huge slice of the canal, and yet France still held more. The struggle over who truly ruled the Suez wasn't over. It was about to turn from banking to gunboats. Owning the biggest single share of the canal was a triumph. it was not the same as owning the canal. Even after Disraeli's midnight coup, the arithmetic was against full British control. Britain held around 44% of the company. French shareholders still held the majority, the remaining 56%. On paper, the Suez Canal was a shared prize, and a contested one, with Britain the powerful newcomer rather than the master. If Britain wanted true command of the waterway its empire now leaned on, ownership of shares alone would never deliver it. Events handed Britain the opening. In the early 1880s, a nationalist uprising swept Egypt, led by an army officer named Ahmed Urabi, in revolt against the foreign control of the country's finances and affairs, the very control that Ismail's debts had invited in. To Britain, unrest in Egypt meant danger to the canal. In 1882, it acted. British warships bombarded Alexandria, an army landed, Urabi's forces were crushed, and British troops seized the canal zone. What had begun as the purchase of shares became, within a few years, a full military occupation of Egypt. Now Britain had what money alone could never buy. It controlled the ground the canal ran through, the government that nominally ran the country, and the traffic that passed between the seas. The Suez Canal had become, in every way that mattered, a British possession. The strategic artery of the entire empire, the fast road binding London to India, to Australia, to the whole eastern half of a world map painted red. For more than 70 years that grip held. The canal was Britain's imperial jugular, guarded jealously through 2 world wars, the single most important waterway the empire owned. Generations of British power flowed through the 100 miles of water the nation had once sworn would never be dug. Then, in 1956, it ended almost as dramatically as it had begun. A new Egyptian leader named Gamal Abdel Nasser, set on reclaiming his country's sovereignty, nationalized the Suez Canal, took it back for Egypt. Britain, together with France and Israel, invaded to seize it once more. But the world had changed. Under fierce international pressure, the invaders were forced into humiliating retreat, and the episode is remembered as the moment Britain's age as a global superpower quietly died. The canal that had marked the empire's rise now marked its fall. Look back then at where it all turned. History remembers the pageantry of 1869, the kings, the fireworks, the French triumph in the sand. But the moment that truly handed Britain the canal came later, and in silence, no crowds, no ceremony, just a quiet understanding between a prime minister and a banker. £4 million moved in the dark, and an empire buying its way into a waterway it had sworn would never matter. The greatest strategic prize of the age was won not on a battlefield, but in a drawing room, with a handful of grapes and a single question. What is your security? The British government. And for the better part of a century, that was enough.